The year was 1941. Across the vast expanse of Eastern Europe, Nazi propaganda machines churned out their twisted vision of the perfect world. Women, they declared, belonged in kitchens and nurseries, not on battlefields. German radio broadcasts mocked the very idea of Soviet women taking up arms. What kind of desperate nation, they sneered, sends girls to do men's work? But deep in the heart of Kiev, a 25-year-old history student named Lyudmila Pavlichenko was about to make the Nazis eat every word. She wasn't supposed to be a warrior. Born in a small Ukrainian village, Lyudmila had always been different, quieter than other girls, more focused, with an intensity that burned behind her dark eyes. While her classmates gossiped about romance, she found herself drawn to the local shooting club. There was something pure about the discipline required, the steady breath, the perfect stillness, the absolute precision of a single moment that could change everything. Her friends thought it was just a hobby. Her professors expected her to become a teacher or perhaps a museum curator. But when Hitler's war machine rolled across the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, everything changed. The peaceful student who had spent hours perfecting her marksmanship suddenly understood why fate had placed a rifle in her hands. The recruitment office buzzed with nervous energy that summer morning. Young men lined up to join the Red Army, their faces a mixture of determination and terror. When Lyudmila stepped into that chaos, wearing a simple dress and carrying her shooting club credentials, the officers barely looked up. "We need nurses," one said dismissively. "Not more mouths to feed." Lyudmila's response was quiet but firm. "I'm here to kill fascists, not heal them." The officer laughed until he saw her shooting scores. Her accuracy was beyond exceptional. It was almost supernatural. Still, skepticism lingered. This soft-spoken woman with gentle features didn't look like anyone's idea of a soldier. But the Red Army was desperate, and desperation has a way of opening doors that prejudice keeps locked. Within weeks, Private Pavlichenko was issued a Mosin-Nagant rifle and assigned to the 25th Rifle Division. As she held that weapon for the first time as a soldier, she couldn't have imagined that it would become an extension of her very soul, or that German soldiers would soon whisper her name in terrified prayers. Asterisk. The port city of Odessa sprawled along the Black Sea coast like a wounded giant. By August 1941, Romanian and German forces had it surrounded, slowly strangling the life from its defenders. This was where Lyudmila Pavlichenko would receive her baptism of fire and where the legend of Lady Death would be born. Her first kill came on a scorching afternoon when the sun turned the Ukrainian steppe into a shimmering oven. She had been lying motionless in a bombed-out building for nearly 6 hours, watching German advance positions through her scope. Her commanding officer, still doubtful about this university girl, had positioned himself nearby to observe. Through the crosshairs, she tracked a German machine gunner who had been terrorizing Soviet positions all morning. He was methodical, professional, exactly the kind of soldier who could pin down an entire company. Lyudmila controlled her breathing, feeling her heartbeat slow to an almost meditative rhythm. The world narrowed to nothing but that distant figure and the gentle pressure of her finger on the trigger. The shot rang out like thunder in the oppressive silence. 300 meters away, the German gunner crumpled. Her commanding officer stared through his binoculars, then at this quiet woman beside him, unable to reconcile what he had just witnessed. Did you mean to do that?" ESTAMMER. ED.LYUDMIL was already searching for her next target. "That's what I'm here for." Word of the female sniper spread quickly through both armies. Soviet soldiers began to feel a strange mixture of pride and protective instinct toward this unexpected comrade. German forces, meanwhile, responded with a combination of outrage and disbelief. Their radio intercepts crackled with confused reports. "There's a woman shooting at us." "Impossible." "I'm telling you, it's a woman." By her fifth confirmed kill, the mockery from German propaganda had taken on a more sinister edge. They began targeting her specifically, not just as an enemy combatant, but as a symbol of everything they despised about Soviet society. "This is what happens," their broadcast declared, "when a nation becomes so degraded that it sends women to fight." But Lyudmila wasn't listening to enemy propaganda. She was perfecting her craft in the crucible of combat. Each engagement taught her something new: how shadows moved with the sun, how wind patterns shifted near the coast, how fear changed the way people moved. She learned to read the battlefield like a book written in life and death. The siege of Odessa lasted 73 days. When it finally fell to overwhelming enemy numbers, Lyudmila had recorded 36 confirmed kills. As Soviet forces evacuated across the Black Sea, she carried more than just her rifle. She carried the growing reputation of a soldier who never missed when it mattered most. Asterisk. The fortress city of Sevastopol clung to the Crimean Peninsula like a stubborn fist raised against the Nazi tide. Here, among the ancient fortifications and rocky cliffs overlooking the Black Sea, Lyudmila Pavlichenko would transform from a skilled sniper into something approaching myth. The landscape around Sevastopol was perfect sniper country: endless ravines, dense forests, and abandoned buildings that had been carved by artillery into natural hunting blinds. For a marksman with patience and skill, it was paradise. For German soldiers advancing through that terrain, it became a nightmare where death could come from anywhere, at any time. Lyudmila had evolved far beyond the university student who had first picked up a rifle. War had sharpened every sense, honed every instinct. She could read the battlefield like a master chess player reading a board, anticipating enemy movements sometimes hours before they happened. Her camouflage techniques had become legendary. She could disappear into terrain so completely that Soviet soldiers would sometimes walk within feet of her position without detection. Her hunting method was meticulous, almost ritualistic. She would study target areas for days before moving, memorizing every tree, every shadow, every potential firing position. Then she would slip into position before dawn, often carrying only water and a few pieces of bread, prepared to remain motionless for 12 hours or more. Some of her most successful hunts lasted multiple days, with Lyudmila lying in the same position, waiting for the perfect moment. The psychological impact of her presence began to exceed even her impressive kill count. German units operating in sectors where she was known to be active became increasingly paranoid and demoralized. Soldiers who had marched confidently across Poland and France now found themselves jumping at shadows, afraid to show themselves for even seconds at a time. Intelligence reports captured from German positions revealed the growing legend surrounding her. They called her the ghost in the trees, and some units refused to advance through certain areas where she was suspected to be operating. Officers complained that discipline was breaking down as soldiers became obsessed with this invisible enemy who struck without warning. By winter 1941, Lyudmila's confirmed kill count had climbed past 100. Each number represented not just marksmanship skill, but tactical intelligence, infinite patience, and nerves that remained steady even when German artillery was bracketing her position. She had learned to think like her prey, to anticipate their movements and exploit their psychological weaknesses. Her most spectacular engagement came during a German offensive in December. Intelligence had identified a German observation post that was directing devastating artillery fire onto Soviet positions. The post was protected by multiple layers of security and positioned nearly 400 meters from any possible concealment. For 3 days, Lyudmila studied the position, noting the patterns of guard changes, the brief moments when observers moved between positions. On the fourth morning, as snow began to fall and visibility decreased, she made her move. The shot, at extreme range and deteriorating conditions, took down the senior artillery observer, just as he was calling in coordinates for a major barrage. The disruption of German fire support allowed Soviet forces to launch a counterattack that reclaimed strategic high ground. German command was no longer treating her as just another enemy soldier. She had become a problem that demanded a solution. The humiliation was becoming unbearable. How could the Wehrmacht, the most modern, efficient military machine in history, be confounded by a single woman with a rifle? German High Command made a decision that would define the next phase of Lyudmila's war. They would send their absolute best to eliminate her. The first hunter they sent was Heinz Thorvald, a Bavarian mountaineer who had stalked deer in the Alps since childhood and had recorded over 40 kills on the Eastern Front. He was methodical, patient, and utterly confident in his superiority over any Soviet sniper, especially a woman. Their duel began in the frozen forests outside Sevastopol in January 1942. For 6 days, they hunted each other through a landscape that had been transformed into an abstract sculpture of ice, twisted metal, and splintered trees. Neither could locate the other, though both knew they were being watched. It was a contest of nerves as much as marksmanship. Who would crack first under the pressure of knowing that death was constantly searching for them? Lyudmila had learned to think like her opponents, to anticipate not just their tactics, but their psychology. German snipers, she had observed, were often too confident, too eager to take shots that were marginally within their capability. They had been conditioned by early victories to believe in their own invincibility. This arrogance, she realized, was a weakness she could exploit. On the seventh day, she deliberately exposed a small portion of her position, just enough to suggest carelessness, but not enough to present a clear target. Through her scope, she watched a glint of reflected sunlight from a position she had suspected for 2 days. Thorvald had taken the bait. The shot that followed was perfect, over 300 meters through dense forest, striking the German sniper just as he was adjusting his aim. But they sent another, and another. Each hunter they dispatched was more skilled than the last, more familiar with her tactics, more determined to claim the bounty that Nazi propaganda had placed on her head. With each successful defense of her territory, Lyudmila's reputation grew not just among Soviet forces, but throughout the international press. She was becoming more than a soldier. She was becoming a symbol of Soviet resistance. The most dangerous adversary came in March. Erwin Koenig, a Wehrmacht instructor who had trained the snipers she had already defeated. He studied her previous engagements like a scholar studying literature, looking for patterns, weaknesses, anything that might give him an advantage. For 11 days, they stalked each other through the ruins of Sevastopol, neither able to gain a decisive advantage. Their final confrontation came at dawn on the 12th day. Ken had anticipated her movement and positioned himself perfectly to intercept her as she moved between positions. But Lyudmila had anticipated his anticipation. The shot she fired passed through a gap between 2 concrete blocks, traveled nearly 250 meters, and found its target just as Nig was squeezing his own trigger. By the time reinforcements reached his position, Lyudmila had already melted back into the urban wilderness that had become her domain. German command stopped sending individual hunters. They had learned at terrible cost that she was beyond the reach of conventional sniping tactics. Behind every confirmed kill lay a moment of absolute stillness, the instant between life and death, when Lyudmila's finger tightened on the trigger and another human being ceased to exist. By spring 1942, she had experienced that moment 257 times. Each one had left its mark, not on her marksmanship record, but on her soul. the nightmares had started months earlier. She would wake in her bunker, heart racing, still feeling the recoil of shots fired in dreams. The faces of her targets haunted her, not because she regretted killing them, but because she remembered them all. Every German soldier who had fallen to her rifle had been someone's son, brother, perhaps father. The weight of that knowledge grew heavier with each passing day. Her closest friend, Alexandra, a medical corpsman who had served alongside her since Odessa, noticed the changes first. The quick smile that had once lit up Lyudmila's face appeared less frequently. She spoke less during the quiet moments between engagements, and when she did speak, her voice carried a hollow quality that hadn't been there before. "You don't have to carry this alone," Alexandra whispered one night as artillery rumbled in the distance. Lyudmila's response came slowly, each word carefully chosen. "Every shot I don't take might cost 10 of our own soldiers their lives. Every shot I do take costs me a piece of myself. But the mathematics are simple. The mathematics of war, perhaps, but the emotional calculus was far more complex." She had begun to isolate herself from other soldiers, not out of arrogance or cold professionalism, but out of a growing awareness that her presence brought both hope and a terrible burden. Other soldiers looked at her with a mixture of admiration and something approaching awe that made normal human. Connection increasingly difficult. The breaking point came. During a German offensive in April, Lyudmila had been tracking a German officer who was directing assault troops against a thinly defended Soviet position. The shot was routineless, then 200 meters, clear visibility, no wind. But as she watched through her scope, she saw the officer stop to help a wounded soldier, exposing himself to her fire while trying to drag his comrade to safety. The moment stretched endlessly. Here was an enemy soldier displaying the same courage and compassion that she had seen in her own comrades. The crosshairs centered on his chest as he struggled to save another human being. Her finger found the trigger, applied pressure. The shot was perfect, as always. The German officer fell instantly, but something inside Lyudmila broke with that bullet's impact. That night, for the first time since the war began, she wept not for herself, but for all of them. Soviet, German, Romanian, it no longer mattered. They were all just young people dying in the service of old men's ambitions. Alexandra found her sitting alone in their bunker, staring at her rifle as if it were some alien artifact she no longer recognized. "I know what I am now," Lyudmila said quietly. "I'm very good at ending lives, but I can't remember what it feels like to celebrate one." The war had transformed her into something uniquely effective and uniquely isolated. She was the most feared sniper on the Eastern Front, but the cost of that effectiveness was measured in more than enemy casualties. Each confirmed kill had required her to surrender a small piece of her humanity, until she sometimes wondered what would be left when the shooting finally stopped. The mortar round that changed everything fell on a bright morning. In June 1942, Lyudmila was moving between positions when the world exploded around her, a deafening roar followed by darkness. Then the slow return of consciousness, accompanied by searing pain and a metallic taste of blood. Shrapnel had torn through her left shoulder and face, missing her eyes by millimeters, but leaving wounds that would heal into permanent scars. As medics carried her from the battlefield, her first coherent thought wasn't about her injuries, but about her rifle, whether someone had retrieved it, whether it was still functional. When she could return to her position. The field hospital outside Sevastopol was overcrowded with casualties from the intensifying siege. Doctors worked by candlelight, making impossible decisions about which soldiers might be saved and which were beyond help. When they examined Lyudmila's wounds, their initial assessment was grim. Extensive nerve damage in her shoulder, possible permanent vision impairment, psychological trauma that would likely end her combat effectiveness. But they didn't understand who they were treating. Within days of regaining consciousness, Lyudmila was demanding to see her weapon, asking about enemy positions, trying to return to duty despite barely being able to lift her left arm. The woman who had terrorized German forces for nearly a year wasn't ready to surrender her war. Soviet command, however, had other plans. Her fame had spread far beyond the battlefields of Ukraine. International press coverage had transformed her from a local military asset into a global symbol of Soviet resistance. Stalin himself took notice. Here was a hero whose story could be used to rally support both domestically and among potential allies. The decision to evacuate her from combat wasn't entirely medical. Lyudmila Pavlichenko had become too valuable as a propaganda asset to risk losing in the meat grinder of Sevastopol. Her war was ending, but her mission was just beginning as she was transferred to a hospital in Moscow. She carried with her not just physical wounds, but the psychological burden of leaving the fight unfinished. Her final confirmed kill count stood at 309, a number that would soon become legendary, but which felt incomplete to the woman who had achieved it. Lying in her hospital bed, she could still hear the distant rumble of artillery from Sevastopol. Somewhere in those ruins, German soldiers were breathing easier, unaware that their most dangerous enemy had been forced from the field not by superior tactics or marksmanship, but by random shrapnel and the demands of international politics. The woman the Nazis couldn't kill had been sidelined by her own success. The America that greeted Lyudmila Pavlichenko in August 1942 was a nation grappling with its own contradictions about women and war. While American factories employed millions of women in defense production, the idea of women in actual combat remained deeply uncomfortable for most Americans. Into this environment stepped a soft-spoken Ukrainian who had personally killed more enemy soldiers than entire American battalions. The tour was designed to build support for the Soviet war effort and encourage America to open a second front in Europe. What nobody anticipated was how completely Lyudmila would captivate and challenge American audiences. Here was living proof that women could be effective warriors not just in supporting roles, but as deadly combatants who could outfight the best soldiers Germany could field. Her first major appearance was at the International Student Assembly in Washington. American students, many of whom had never seen combat, sat mesmerized as this young woman matter-of-factly described her experiences on the Eastern Front. When questions turned to whether she felt remorse for her actions, her response was immediate and unflinching. I have killed 309 fascist invaders. Each one was trying to kill my people, destroy my country, enslave my countrymen. I sleep well at night. The crowd erupted in applause, but Lyudmila wasn't finished. She had been listening to American debates about when or whether to open a second front, and her patience with such discussions was limited. Gentlemen, she continued, her voice rising with passion, I am 25 years old, and I have killed 309 fascist occupiers by now. Don't you think, gentlemen, that you have been hiding behind my back for too long? The speech made international headlines. Here was a Soviet woman challenging American men to match her courage, questioning their commitment to defeating fascism. American newspapers struggled to categorize her. She defied every stereotype about both women and communists. Eleanor Roosevelt took a personal interest in Lyudmila, hosting her at the White House and engaging in long conversations about women's roles in modern warfare. Roosevelt was fascinated by this living contradiction to American assumptions about gender and combat. Here was undeniable proof that women could excel in roles previously reserved for men and do so at the highest levels of performance. The tour took her across America, from Chicago's industrial centers to Hollywood's entertainment capital. Everywhere she went, crowds gathered to see the woman who had single-handedly terrorized the Wehrmacht. American women especially connected with her story, seeing in her success a challenge to their own limited opportunities. But beneath the public appearances and diplomatic functions, Lyudmila carried the weight of leaving her war unfinished. While she spoke to American audiences about the need to defeat fascism, her comrades were still fighting and dying in the ruins of Sevastopol. The disconnect between her celebrity status and the ongoing reality of combat created a profound sense of guilt that no amount of applause could ease. The war ended, but its echoes never truly faded. Lyudmila returned to a Soviet Union that had paid an unimaginable price for victory. 27 million dead, entire cities reduced to rubble, a generation scarred by experiences that defied comprehension. She completed her university degree, became a historian, and tried to build a normal life from the fragments of what remained. But normalcy proved elusive for someone who had lived so intensely on the edge between life and death. The skills that had made her legendary in combat: absolute focus, emotional detachment, the ability to remain motionless for hours while calculating trajectories of death, translated poorly to peacetime existence. She struggled with relationships, with civilian work, with the simple act of existing in a world that no longer required her unique talents. The nightmares never completely stopped. In quiet moments, she could still feel the weight of her rifle, still see targets through the crosshairs of memory. Sometimes she would catch herself automatically noting potential sniper positions in urban environments, or calculating range and windage to imaginary targets. The war had ended, but the warrior it had created lived on. International recognition followed her for decades. She received honors from multiple countries, was featured in countless books and documentaries, became a symbol of women's capabilities in combat. Young women around the world drew inspiration from her story, seeing in her success proof that gender need not define one's potential contributions to history. Yet perhaps her most important legacy wasn't the number of enemies she had killed, but the assumptions she had destroyed. Every shot she fired had been aimed not just at German soldiers, but at the prejudices that claimed women couldn't be effective warriors. Every confirmed kill was a small victory against the notion that courage and combat effectiveness were exclusively masculine traits. In her later years, when journalists asked about her wartime experiences, she would often redirect conversations toward her fallen comrades, the thousands of Soviet women who had served in combat roles, many of whom died unknown and unrecognized. Her individual achievements, impressive as they were, represented just one story among millions of women who had refused to accept limitations imposed by society's expectations. The final irony of her story was that the woman who had become famous for taking lives spent her post-war years dedicated to preserving them through historical research, education, and her work with veteran organizations. The same precision and dedication that had made her lethal in combat, she applied to ensuring that the sacrifices of her generation would not be forgotten. When Lyudmila Pavlichenko died in 1974, she was buried with full military honors in Moscow's Novodevichy Cemetery. Her gravestone bears her name, dates, and military decorations, but no mention of her kill count. Perhaps that omission was deliberate, a recognition that her true legacy wasn't the number of lives she had taken, but the barriers she had broken and the possibilities she had opened for future generations of women. The rifle that had made her famous was retired to a museum, but the questions her life had raised about gender, war, and human potential continued to resonate. In a world that had insisted women belonged only in supporting roles, she had proven that when survival was at stake, the only qualification that mattered was effectiveness. The university student who had picked up a rifle to defend her homeland had become something far more significant than a skilled sniper. She had become proof that courage, competence, and deadly precision recognized no gender boundaries, and that Sometimes the most profound changes in history come not from grand proclamations, but from individuals who simply refuse to accept the limitations others place upon them.